Hi everyone, welcome to another video in the Engaging with Art series, today focused on process. Process is something that is very important to acknowledge, I think, whenever we are discussing artwork, because it's fundamental to how the work comes into being in general. This is following off of the merit video, and I was kind of inspired by the idea of how we gauge merit. Like I was discussing in that video, there are some objective ways we want to kind of approach merit, but I think it's important when we're looking at the merit of artwork to acknowledge the context within its creation. And by that sort of weird way of saying it, I just mean we have to acknowledge the process that was used and how it was used. Just to lay some groundwork, the way that I define or understand process essentially is the way by which an artist produces, or how an artist arrives at their art. When it comes to process, you have different types, right? You have some concrete things. You have some actual physical tools that artists use, like, for example, paints and brushes, or pencils and paper. Or you have, say, a movie set or a recording studio. These are physical, tangible things that are used in order to actually bring a physical, or physical for lack of a better term, creation into being. At the same time, however, you have some more esoteric or ethereal aspects of process that are, I think, the things that kind of encapsulate more artists of different media. The idea of like communicating certain ideas or emotions is something that's a universal process within artists in general, that a painter is going to want to convey ideas as well as, say, a film director, but it's a different process in the physical sense. Along those lines, we have things like how artists get into their element, or how they achieve that sense of flow state or concentration, or how they connect with particular emotions through their media. And process here is a bit twofold in the sense that we have our concrete things to consider, but then we also have some of the more thought or content-driven things. So how this follows along from merit, as I discussed at the beginning, is that understanding process or considering the process behind an artwork allows a viewer to judge a work's merit within the context of the production process. This kind of goes back to the idea of like a book makes a poor movie and vice versa, because you're looking at two very unique media that are produced in two very different ways. And it might sound silly, but if you literally were to take a book and set it in front of you as if it was like on a TV screen, it would be a poor movie in that exact physical sense, because it's not going to do what the movie would do for you when it comes to how it's supposed to be engaged with and viewed. Again, it's kind of coming back to the idea of like, we can't judge how successful one media is against the qualifications or the production or of another. We have to recognize how an object came to be in the path by which that artist followed to get there. And that's what process is. It's that journey taken by the artist to arrive at that art object. One thing to keep in mind, even as an uninformed viewer, is that the end product is always going to give us clues as to how it was created. When it comes to contemporary art, this is something that can be very helpful as well. I encourage you to start really scrutinizing the actual physical elements of it, because it's going to give you clues as to how it came about. You're going to start recognizing small things that I think will start to uncover the larger scale. The artist chose that particular process and chose that particular form of creation to arrive at that end product for a reason. Approaching art can't be the same for all media, which is something that I think I've continued to reiterate throughout this series. And we have to meet the work according to its production, its process, in order to understand why. One thing that comes to mind for me that I do want to share in this regard is like assemblage sculpture. If you haven't seen assemblage sculpture, I encourage you to give a little Google of that and find maybe some examples, especially some installation work, because there are a lot of examples, especially like of deconstructionism, where you have sculptures that tend to almost look like just piles of very crude forms just sort of layered together. I think once you really spend time with her to understand these types of sculptures, they can really come alive for you, truthfully. My point in bringing this up, though, as an example, is just that when you look at assemblage sculpture like that, I think it's very clear immediately to see that it's, taking these forms and breaking them down and, for lack of a better term, looking like just rubbish kind of piled together, like it's something just tossed aside. But when you look at what's there and you start to pick apart what it is that artist is actually using to form that sculpture, that's going to start to inform and help you understand why they arrived at this place and what they might be trying to say. And that's the whole point when it comes to this engaging with art, is it's about trying to seek what it is that the artist wants to convey. At this point in the video, I want to use my own work and my process as a sort of case study. So I'm a figurative artist, as I'm sure you probably know if you've seen my work before, and I utilize realism and I utilize the human form as a vehicle for expression. If you look at my work and see very realistically rendered figures, that isn't the end goal. My end goal in my work is not to depict really pretty looking people, really like nicely done people. For me, that realism is a tool that I utilize in order to convey the emotions and ideas. I view the human form as a vessel of expression, and I mean that very sincerely, that the human form becomes the conduit through which I am trying to express ideas and emotions for the viewer. The point, though, is that I am trying to use the figure in a way that ultimately is serving the end goals. When you look at my work, I'm trying to use the figure, I'm trying to use realism, I'm trying to use the values, the colors, everything, and I would argue down to the pencils and the paper itself. I'm using all these things in different capacities in order to share ideas and emotions so that the experience of the viewer is drawn into those ideas and those emotions. As a result, my whole process is tailored towards this end. And that's the thing. That's what I keep, again, reiterating, is it's like my focus is on connecting with the ideas and the emotions. When I'm working, I don't sit down to just try to build layers on a figure in sort of a monotonous way or a disconnected way. It's very crucial for me to make sure that every hour that I'm spending is staying connected with what ultimately is going on in that piece. I often find myself, asking for help to have a sense of authority and confidence when I work, so that I'm taking control of the piece and I know where the piece is going. If I get lost in just trying to build up a figure that looks really nice, ultimately, I'm not serving the work. Ultimately, I'm not following the work as it's supposed to become alive, because my work doesn't start from a place of, I need to depict a figure in this very real image, but rather I need to depict these ideas and emotions. I'm going to use the figure because that's my tool set and that's my, mode de vie, so to speak. That's just an example of how understanding my process is now going to hopefully make your experience with my work a bit richer. It's almost like now understanding that process, like being able to share that with you now, it helps to funnel you in the correct direction. When we look at art, there are so many endless possibilities because of how subjective it all is. So I think it's worth understanding an artist's aspect, an artist's place in it, in order for our experience to be drawn into the correct avenue, so to speak. Now, I want to discuss choices, because this is something that I brought up in the Tools and Choices Part 1 video, but it's something that, again, with process is critical. A process for any artist is essentially a set of choices that they have made within themselves to produce their work. I think this is another one of those universal aspects, right? Like I discussed at the beginning, we have the concrete ones, the pencils, the paper, the brushes, what have you, and then we have those universal, more broad, content-specific, theme-specific things. The painter is going to make choices about how the paint is applied in the same way that the film director is going to make choices about how the scenes are laid out or how a camera is used to shoot a particular scene, or how a musician is going to play a particular instrument to produce a certain sound. These choices turn the basic elements of a process into very artist-specific parts of a process. Throughout history, we have wonderful examples of this because I think some of the greatest artists started using media in unique ways, making those bold choices that ultimately ended up being incredibly successful. Look at Van Gogh, for example. Look at his application of paint. We look back on it now and it's just remarkable. At the time, it was so, I don't even know what the right word is. People just did not take to it during the time. But when we look back, we realize that him and those other post-impressionists, those bold choices they made with their media were ultimately what helped further their vision and furthered art as a whole. Going back to my own work, what I produce, every piece is an aggregate of choices upon choices upon choices. You know, I am constantly trying to be as intentional as possible. That's just a pinnacle or a keystone or a capstone, what have you, of my process is intentionalism, that everything has a reason, every detail, everything is reaching towards that end. And that's something that I enjoy. That's something that I look forward to, that sense of rigor. And for me, that is part of my process. There are plenty of artists who aren't necessarily as intentional, and that in and of itself is an intentional choice. It's just sort of a beautiful thing to remember that artists and processes, they are just so diverse. They are as diverse as the number of artists that exist or have existed. Diving in to learn about that process and those choices is going to inform and enrich your experience. Now it's time to discuss what you can do. Now it's like the call to action, right? That I always sort of seem to be giving you at the end of these now. How do we discover process? How do we, sit down and do the research and come to find this information out in order to have these better experiences with art? One thing I wrote down is to literally just seek out any information the artist offers. I discussed artist statements before already, and I think those are worthwhile. But if you are looking at maybe a modern artist, like contemporary artist who's still living, if you go to their portfolio, their website, a lot of times they'll just put a whole little write-up about their process, like along with the artist statement or within it. And that is very much worth looking into and finding. This is another instance where interviews are very helpful too with artists, especially if they're interviews for those deceased or artists gone before us. You can really learn a lot from what the artist has to say. Maybe it's not about the process specifically they're discussing, but maybe they're discussing a particular piece. Maybe they're discussing a particular body of work, and there are going to be clues in there. Just like there are going to be clues about the ideas and stuff they want to convey, there's probably going to be ideas about the way that they approached their work and the way that they arrived at those conclusions. I will speak for myself, but I love discussing my work and the process. I love it. I love discussing the process a ton. So the other thing I have for you as advice is ask the artist directly. Again, if this is a living artist, if this is somebody still working and active, there's a good chance that if you, make an inquiry into the work, that individual is going to want to share more with you. Now, your mileage may vary. Not all artists are going to be as excited or willing to share, and that's perfectly fine and acceptable. But artists like me, again, speaking for myself, it's a joy for me to discuss the process. It's a joy for me to try and offer more for the viewer. So I implore you to ask away. It helps me and it helps you because it gets me thinking about my process and it helps you experience my work differently. More broadly, I would also encourage you just to do some research on media. Like, do research on oil paints or acrylic paints or colored pencils like I use, for example, if you're unfamiliar with the medium itself. As I discussed earlier, assemblage sculpture, maybe you haven't heard of that. Maybe do a quick Google search, maybe avail yourself of Wikipedia, though it's not always the best resource. See what it has to offer to give yourself a starting point, to understand sort of like the broader characteristics of a medium, and you'll also probably find in there how it has been used throughout history. I think the important thing is if we understand the medium and the way it can be used, when we watch it get used in unconventional ways, we're immediately starting to think, well, why? If you see an artist who applied oil paint with really thick, heavy strokes, which is something called impasto, that's a technique. If you see that technique used you'll immediately start to wonder, well, why did they do this when you could do what Da Vinci did and paint the Mona Lisa with oil paints in such a beautiful and realistic way? The fact that one uses the same medium in a different way as the other, but it's the same medium, there are decisions there, right? And so if we try to understand that or ask those questions, we're going to start to maybe have a better view or understanding of the work itself. So I'm sure some medium can seem pretty simple to us, right? Like pencils or maybe paints in like a broad sense. But, I'm sure if you really think hard enough when it comes to art, there are probably plenty of media out there that you really don't understand in terms of what it is they're used for, how they're used. I don't know a lot about films. I don't. Like, I know a little bit, but there's plenty to learn. Even photography. I took a photography class one time, which was really illuminating, but there is so much to photography that I don't even understand still. And I've just only scratched the surface and can tell you that it's a deep well. It's worth exploring. And as I continue to, champion for video games, for example, are probably a medium that you don't understand how it works at all. And I think a lot of folks don't. That's another very complex medium that has a lot of different layers. There are a lot of aspects to it, and like a technological and artistic like marriage, so to speak, that's worth maybe exploring. How do these get made? How has this evolved? How have all of these techniques in media evolved? Understanding process is going to allow us to understand how an art object came to be and how it was produced and how it exists in its present state. And if we can understand that a little bit better, it's going to be yet another doorway into understanding what an artist is trying to convey and thus how we can understand the work. I think I'll stop there. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope this was a worthwhile and enjoyable sort of look and approach to understanding process. I encourage you to share this with anybody else who might find it worthwhile or useful. And until the next one, bye everybody. Take care.